欢迎回来。2008年9月，雷曼兄弟轰然崩塌，引发全球性的金融危机乃至经济危机。5年来，各国不断完善危机应对机制，调整金融监管政策，甚至机构布局。在中国，由上海自贸区开路，以利率市场化、资本向下可兑换加速、金融自由化等为特征的金融改革大幕初起。中国面临的机会和风险又应如何平衡？带着这些问题，财经记者近期专访了新经济思维研究所高级研究员、英国金融服务管理局前主席特纳勋爵。特纳在2008年临危受命，主持英国负责金融监管的机构金融服务局。他挂帅的5年，也是 FSA 16年历程中最棘手的时期。离职后，他加入了新经济思维研究所任高级研究员。2012年，特纳著书《危机之后的经济学：目标与手段》，批判传统经济学思维中市场自由化至上、盲目追求 GDP 最大化、忽视贫富差距扩大等政策导向。他也曾直言，金融业某些创新对社会无用。
It's a 4-5 years since the Lehman collapse. Global banks have indeed improving on their capital adequacy ratio, but on many of the other fronts, reform have not gone fundamental enough. The Economist argued last week that current reforms are not enough to stem the next crisis from coming. What's your opinion on this?
I would say two things, however. First, ideally, I would have even more capital in the banking system to make it safer. Secondly, and I think this is the more fundamental point, I think the banking system has got safer, but I think there are still major changes in the nature of our economies, and I think we still have a gradual increase in leverage across the whole world, debt to GDP. The core of the background to this crisis in 2008 was not just things that happened in the few years before, but really a 50-year period or a 70-year period of gradually increasing private sector leverage. The core reason why we have had this post-crisis recession in the US, in the advanced economies, and why it has lasted so long, is the deleveraging process. So at the global level, we haven't produced a less leveraged economy. We've simply shifted the leverage to other areas.
It seems the reason behind increasing leverage in China is relatively simple. Credit and monetary expansion cannot be effectively transferred to the productive use of the real economy. What do you think is the root cause of this, and how should we get out of this conundrum?
A lot of it has to do with, if you have state-owned banks and local governments and state-owned enterprises, these are people who know each other, particularly, I think, at the level of the provincial state-owned banks and the provincial state-owned enterprises, perhaps even more than at the national state-owned bank levels. So there is a bias in the system which tends to put the investment into the state-owned enterprises and the local government rather than into the private sector, which is why many private sector business borrowers are dependent on either peer-to-peer lending or the entrusted loans or other categories of the shadow banking system. And I think this is clearly something which is an important part of the reform process, to break some of those links. Now, some people would say this will require the actual privatization of the state-owned banks, maybe the provincial state-owned banks, to break that close link with their sister state organizations. But the details have to be worked out. But certainly there is a skew, there is a bias in the system which, left to itself, will tend to push credit in a particular direction which may well not be the optimal direction for the Chinese economy.
Universal banking is obviously an area where major reform efforts have been devoted to post-crisis. 3 different approaches have been came up with by 3 different countries, but implementation of these have been relatively slow, especially in the US. What do you think should be the right approach to do that?
Well, it's quite interesting. There were 3 different sets of recommendations about what to do about the combination of different functions within a universal commercial investment banks. They were the Volcker's proposal in the US, which said a commercial bank cannot do proprietary trading. They were the Vickers proposal in the UK that said that you had to ring-fence your retail commercial banking from your wholesale, commercial and investment banking. And then there was the Liikanen proposals in Europe, which said you had to ring-fence, but not cease, the whole of investment banking from the whole of wholesale business or retail commercial banking. I think all of these things can be useful. I think the Vickers one, maybe it's just because I'm in Britain and I've got used to it. I think it has a certain clarity. However, I don't think these are... I think we must always see these things as not sufficient. The thing that I would never assume with the Vickers or the Liikanen proposal, I would never assume that once you've ring-fenced part of the balance sheet, you can ignore the rest.
Recently, the chairman of China CBRC, Shang Fulin, raised the principle of ring-fencing in response to the huge universal banking drive in China. What's your opinion on China heading towards that direction and the necessary regulation it entails?
If I were China, I'd think very carefully about it. I think if you look at... Although I think the big story of the origin of the crisis in the US was the relentless increase in leverage, I think in its final stages that increase in leverage was made easier by the way that the breakdown in the Glass-Steagall Act made it easier for large commercial banks, which were also trading banks, to drive a securitization and shadow banking process. And so I think China should think very carefully about it.
尽管已经过去了5年，但是我们不得不承认，危机改变了金融行业。英美等国也对昔日万事以创新为先的倾向有所反思。今年初，特纳曾服务过的金融服务局部分监管职能正式回归英格兰银行。中国的金融创新还在路上，借由后发优势，中国的金融业近年来发展迅速，但是既有欧美之国的前车之鉴，我们的监管仍需谨慎。